JD Vance denied service at restaurant. What he did next shocked everyone. A small diner, a conservative town, and a rejection that brought the entire room to silence. When JD Vance walked in, he never expected that a simple meal would turn into a tense confrontation. The averted gazes, the hushed whispers, and then a decision that made everything stop. No one thought he would react the way he did. No one expected what happened next to change the way people saw things. Can a conversation change prejudice? Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow, we'll bring you another inspiring story, crafted just for you. And now the story begins. They told JD Vance to leave, assuming he would be furious, but his response left the entire diner in silence. JD Vance pulled into the parking lot of Owen's Diner, a modest little eatery in the heart of Springfield, Ohio, the kind of place that had been around for decades, with a flickering neon sign and the scent of grilled meat and freshly brewed coffee seeping through the cracks every time the door swung open. He had heard about the place earlier that morning from a local, someone who raved about their homemade meatloaf and hand-cut fries. After a long day of meetings, handshakes, and policy discussions, all he wanted was a quiet meal before heading back. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. The diner was small but cozy, at least at first. It was the kind of place where regulars had their own designated seats, where the wall near the cash register was lined with faded Polaroids, capturing faces of patrons and employees over the years. The air was thick with the aroma of sizzling bacon grease and strong coffee, mingling with the low murmur of conversation. JD locked eyes with the waitress behind the counter. Her smile faltered the moment she recognized him. It happened in a split second, less than a heartbeat, but he caught it. That hesitation. Her expression shifted, lips pressing into a thin, tight line. His gaze swept the room. A few customers had turned toward him. A man, mid-bite into his burger, leaned slightly to whisper something to his companion. A woman in a flannel shirt set her coffee cup down a little too firmly, her eyes narrowing before quickly darting away. JD Vance was denied service. His response left everyone in shock. JD was no stranger to unwelcome rooms. He had walked into enough of them to know when he wasn't wanted. But here, in a small-town diner, the waitress hesitated, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she stepped forward. "Good evening," she said cautiously. "Dine in or take out?" JD let out a tired chuckle. "Dine in, if that's all right." Another pause. Too long for such a simple question. She cast a quick glance toward the kitchen, then back at him. "I just need to check something. Give me a moment." She disappeared behind the swinging kitchen doors. JD stood there, feeling the weight of more eyes turning toward him. A man sitting at the counter shifted slightly. Someone murmured under their breath. Something about this felt off. Seconds ticked by. Behind the kitchen doors, voices rose and fell, low but urgent, not quite clear enough for him to catch their words. JD straightened his back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't jumping to conclusions either. Maybe it was a policy issue. Maybe they were understaffed. The waitress returned. This time, there was no hesitation in her expression. She had made up her mind, or someone had made it up for her. "I'm sorry," she said firmly, "but we can't serve you tonight." The way she said it, the air in the room, the silence thickening around them. It was all clear now. This wasn't about business. For a brief moment, JD Vance said nothing. The words hung between them, heavy, final, not requiring further explanation. The diner grew still, not silent. There was still the faint sizzle from the grill in the kitchen, the scrape of a fork against porcelain somewhere in the background. But the usual hum of conversation had faded. People were watching, waiting. JD studied the waitress's face. There was no hostility there, just resolve. As if the decision had already been made. Or perhaps it had been made for her. His gaze shifted past her shoulder, toward the kitchen window. Behind the counter, two cooks stood partially obscured by stacks of plates under the heat lamps. Their expressions were unreadable. His fingers brushed against the smooth surface of the counter as he exhaled, considering his next move. JD Vance was denied service. His response left everyone in shock. He cleared his throat. "Excuse me, have I done something wrong?" The waitress didn't look away, her previous hesitation now gone. "It's just, we don't want to serve you tonight. No policy, no excuse about closing early. Just that." JD placed his hands on his hips, exhaling through his nose. He was no stranger to tense situations. Heated political debates, interviews designed to trip him up. But there was something different about being turned away from a roadside diner. A dry cough broke the silence. JD turned slightly and met the gaze of an older man sitting near the counter. He looked like he'd been coming here for years, the faded blue work jacket frayed at the cuffs, the calloused hands of a man who had spent a lifetime earning his keep. The man shook his head, more to himself than anyone else, then returned to spearing the last bite of egg on his plate. A few tables away, a woman shifted in her seat, her expression unreadable. Across from her, a younger man, probably in his mid-30s, leaned back, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a show put on just for him. JD felt it all. The eyes that darted away the moment he met them, the ones that lingered just a second too long, and the ones that held something sharper, a quiet, unspoken satisfaction. The weight of the moment settled on him. He had a choice. He could turn around and walk out, shake his head, let it go. He could demand an explanation, call them out, ask if they realized how this would look when it hit the news in the morning. He could escalate, see if they still stood by their decision when they realized they had just refused service to a United States senator. But he did none of those things. "All right." He nodded slowly, his voice measured, deliberate. "Can I speak to the manager?" A few people tensed. The waitress hesitated again. Her eyes flickered toward the kitchen, as if silently seeking permission. The old man at the counter muttered something under his breath. Near the window, someone let out a short, incredulous laugh, like they couldn't believe he was actually doing this. JD simply stood there, waiting. The waitress disappeared through another door. More silence. A sip of coffee. The faint scrape of a plate against the counter. Then the door swung open. A man, likely in his 50s, stepped out. Broad shoulders, a direct gaze. His muscular arms crossed over a grease-stained apron. The name Don was printed on the tag pinned to his chest. He didn't ask JD Vance what he wanted. He simply looked him over once and spoke. "I hear you have a question." There was no courtesy in his tone, no politeness. It was a challenge. JD met his gaze steadily, his expression unreadable. He hadn't come here to argue. He had no intention of throwing his weight around to get what he wanted. But he also wasn't about to leave without understanding what was happening. I'd like to know why you're refusing to serve me." Don inhaled sharply through his nose, the kind of breath someone takes when they expect a question but still don't feel like answering it. Slowly, he wiped his hands on his apron, his eyes flicking across the diner. Some customers pretended not to notice. Others didn't even bother to hide their curiosity. "Look, this isn't personal." JD arched an eyebrow. "Sure seems personal." Don clenched his jaw. He ran a hand over the back of his neck and exhaled. A slow, deliberate sigh. "People around here have opinions about you, about what you stand for." He paused briefly, his gaze shifting toward the counter. "I have a business to run. I don't want trouble." JD nodded slightly, letting the words settle. He had been in difficult situations before, political debates that turned hostile, interviews designed to trap him. But there was something different about being turned away from a small roadside diner. "So, just sitting down to eat dinner is trouble now?" Don didn't respond right away. His eyes flicked toward the counter, where the older man in the worn work jacket had returned to his plate of eggs, chewing a little slower now. A few tables over, the younger man remained leaning back in his chair, arms crossed, watching the exchange like it was the best entertainment he'd had all week. JD had seen this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. This wasn't just about one decision. It was about what that decision meant, about how it would be perceived. about how people would react. It was the ripple effect, the pressure that came from every direction, the quiet, invisible force that could push a person into making a choice they weren't even sure was their own. Be honest with me. Do you really believe in this? Or is this just a way to keep the peace? Don hesitated. His fingers tightened slightly on the edge of his apron. And for the first time, JD saw something that resembled doubt. As if Don wasn't as certain about this as he wanted to appear. But before he could answer, the younger man in the corner let out a short, amused laugh. Oh, come on. What's the big deal? You're not welcome here. That's all there is to it. JD turned, studying him for a moment. The type who liked stirring the pot, someone who thrived on throwing out comments just to watch the reaction. But JD didn't take the bait. Instead, he turned back to Dawn. I don't have a problem leaving, if that's truly what you want. The words hung in the air, an open door, a chance for Dawn to reconsider, a moment to breathe, a sliver of space to push back against whatever pressure had led to this moment. Dawn's eyes flicked toward the kitchen. I just don't want this to get worse. Finally, he spoke. JD nodded. He didn't either. A long silence stretched between them. He could walk away, shake his head, turn his back, and never think about this place again. He could make a phone call, turn this into a headline, let public outrage do what it did best. But instead, he did something no one expected. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Then let's talk. The air in the diner went taut, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight. JD hadn't slammed the chair down, hadn't squared his shoulders or raised his voice. He simply sat, both hands resting on the table, as if he had all the time in the world. The diner wasn't used to confrontations like this. The ones before had always ended quickly. Someone walked out or someone backed down. But this time, neither happened. Dawn watched him for a long moment, then exhaled slowly. Talk? He repeated the word as if it didn't belong here. You don't want me here. I get that. What I don't understand is why. So let's talk about it. A quiet chuckle drifted from the corner table. This guy's got guts. The younger man leaned back, arms crossed, amusement flickering in his eyes. JD ignored him. Dawn pulled out the chair across from him but didn't sit. Instead, he rested his arms over the chair's back, his stance guarded. A light dusting of flour clung to his apron, probably from the morning shift. I run a diner. I don't start trouble. I don't want to end up in the headlines. But I've got a whole community to think about. JD nodded. All right, then tell me. What does this community think of me? Dawn glanced over his shoulder, as if hoping someone else would answer for him. The waitress, behind the counter, shifted her weight from foot to foot, looking uneasy. The older man in the work jacket kept his head down, his fork hovering motionless over his plate. Finally, Dawn turned back. People around here don't trust politicians. They don't believe in them. And some of the things you've said, some of the things you've stood for, they don't sit right with them. JD leaned back in his chair, eyes steady. That makes sense. But you don't actually know me, do you? Dawn hesitated. No, I don't know you personally. Then be honest. If I were just some stranger walking in here, not someone you've seen on TV, would we be having this conversation? Silence settled over the room. JD let it stretch, watching Dawn's expression shift. Just slightly. It wasn't a full change, not an epiphany, but something cracked. Just a hairline fracture. Before he could answer, a scoff broke the moment. This has nothing to do with TV. The young man in the corner jutted his chin forward, eyes lit with challenge. It has to do with people knowing exactly who you really are. JD turned to him. Then tell me, who am I? The man smirked, as if relishing finally having the floor. You're just another guy pretending to understand regular people while playing the same political games as everyone else. JD nodded slowly, weighing the words. All right, then tell me, what should I do differently? The young man blinked. That wasn't the reaction he had expected. You want me to leave? JD continued, his voice even. Here's your chance. Say everything you need to say. The diner was dead silent. Even the kitchen had gone still. No clatter of plates, no orders being called. Dawn exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I didn't think tonight was going to turn into this. JD let out a tired smile. Neither of them truly believed things would change tonight. But for the first time, the tension in the room wasn't just about division. It was something else, something closer to understanding. The people who had pretended not to care were now listening, sneaking glances over their plates. He remained seated, patient. The younger man still lounged back in his chair, looking like he wanted to say something, but hesitation flickered across his face for the first time. Maybe he realized JD wasn't arguing, wasn't making excuses, just waiting. Dawn still gripped the back of the chair in front of him, then finally exhaled. You want to know what people think? They think you're all talk. JD didn't respond immediately. He tilted his head slightly, as if weighing the words. They think you talk about working people like us, but you're still playing the same game as the rest of them. They think you're just another guy in a suit, making promises that don't mean a damn thing. And they don't forget. JD nodded slowly. He understood that. The younger man scoffed, a dry chuckle under his breath. That's it? That's all you've got? JD turned to him. What do you want me to say? The man sat up straighter now, a little more agitated. I don't know. You should argue. Defend yourself. Say something. JD rested his forearms on the table, his voice calm. You made up your mind about me before I ever walked in. You wanted me to get angry, to react, so you could feel right about your assumptions. The young man's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. JD continued, his voice steady. But what if I told you I know exactly what that feels like? He turned back to Dawn. You say nothing ever changes. I understand that feeling. I grew up in it. I watched the people around me get left behind. I felt left behind myself. And yes, I went to school, I did things no one thought I could do. But that doesn't mean I forgot where I came from. Dawn's fingers tapped lightly against the back of the chair. His expression was hard to read, but the resistance in his face was fading. Now, he looked like he was thinking. JD glanced around the diner. You don't have to agree with me. I didn't come here to change anyone's mind. But I walked in as a customer, not as a politician. Just a man who wanted a meal. Silence. Then, from the counter, the older man in the work jacket muttered under his breath. Damn shame a man can't even sit down and eat a burger. The tension in the room cracked just slightly. A few people chuckled. Even Dawn let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. So what now? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. His gaze drifted toward the kitchen, where the cooks were still watching. Before turning back to JD, I'll put it this way. You sit here and keep this conversation going. And if, by the end of it, I don't think you're just another guy who talks a good game but doesn't back it up, then maybe, just maybe, I'll have one of my staff bring you a menu. JD nodded, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. Sounds like a deal. For the first time that night, the room didn't feel divided anymore. Felt like a real conversation. The air in the diner had shifted. Dawn's rigid stance had eased, his shoulders no longer locked in resistance. The younger man in the corner wasn't smirking anymore. He sat upright, realizing this was no longer a performance for him to enjoy. Even the silent observers, those who had been quietly judging from the sidelines, no longer seemed so certain of their conclusions. JD leaned forward slightly. All right, let's finish this conversation. Dawn exhaled again before finally sitting down across from him. He looked tired, not the kind of exhaustion from a long shift, but the deeper kind, the weight of expectations, the years of feeling like the world outside never really listened. I'll be honest. I don't know if you're the man people say you are. I don't know if you actually care about folks like us or if you're just another politician who's good with words. JD nodded. That's fair. Dawn studied him for a long moment before continuing. But I do know one thing. People around here have long memories. They remember every promise made to them. They remember every handshake, every time someone looked them in the eye and said they'd do something, and then turned around and never came back. JD tapped his knuckles lightly against the table, considering the words before speaking again, his voice deliberate. I don't blame them for that. Dawn let out a short, dry chuckle, shaking his head. That's the thing. No one ever does. A pause stretched between them. Then, from the counter, the older man in the worn work jacket spoke up. I worked in the factory for 35 years. 35 damn years. He set his coffee mug down, the soft clink against the counter cutting through the quiet. I watched my neighbors lose their jobs, saw entire families pack up and leave because there was nothing left to keep them here. I've seen politicians come through, shake a few hands, tell us they understand, and then drive off, back to whatever the hell place they came from. JD met his gaze, steady and unwavering. Do you think I'm one of them? The man studied him for a long moment, sharp eyes measuring. Then he shrugged. I don't know. He lifted a calloused finger, pointing at him. But I do know one thing. You're the only one who stayed to listen. The words settled over the room. The waitress behind the counter shifted, glancing at Dawn. In the kitchen, the two cooks exchanged a look, as if, for the first time that night, they were wondering if there was something worth reconsidering. Well, what now? Dawn tapped his fingers against the table, glanced toward the kitchen, then sighed. Finally, he stood up. Mary, get him a menu. A ripple of quiet surprise moved through the diner. The young man in the corner scoffed but didn't argue. Linda hesitated for just a second before grabbing one of the laminated menus and bringing it over. JD took it, nodding slightly. Thank you. Dawn shook his head, half amused, half still skeptical. I'm still not sure I like you. JD smiled, flipping open the menu. That's all right. I don't need everyone to like me. Dawn let out a short laugh before turning toward the kitchen. All right, boys, fire up the grill. What had started as a rejection turned into something no one in that diner would forget. The tension hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had softened just enough for the sound of forks clinking against plates to return, for conversations to murmur back to life. JD sat in the corner, menu in hand, but he wasn't reading it. He watched Dawn, the old man at the counter, the young man who still looked skeptical but was no longer smirking. Linda walked over and poured him a cup of coffee without a word. He nodded in thanks. We make it strong around here. JD took a sip, raising an eyebrow. I can tell. A few chuckles broke the air. Not many, but enough to chip away at the lingering unease. Dawn stood near the kitchen, arms crossed, still watching him, as if trying to figure out exactly what kind of man he was. Finally, he sighed, then turned back, pulling out the chair across from him once more. All right, tell me. JD set the menu down. Tell you what? Dawn tilted his head, thinking for a moment. Has this ever happened to you before? JD considered the question. Not the rejection itself. Rejection was part of his job. People could admire him one day and despise him the next. But being turned away from a place like this in this way with this kind of weight behind it? No. Not like this. Dawn nodded slowly, as if that answer confirmed something he had been wondering. And yet, you stayed? JD leaned back slightly, taking another sip of coffee. Yeah. Dawn let out a small chuckle. Most people in your position would have left by now. Maybe made a scene, called a lawyer, or made sure the whole country heard about it by morning. JD smirked, shrugging. Crossed my mind. Dawn laughed, shaking his head, but his voice grew quieter. You know, you're not going to change everyone's mind. JD nodded. I know. Dawn exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. I won't promise I won't regret serving you by tomorrow morning. JD grinned, unfazed. That's fair. From the counter, the older man spoke again, his gaze still fixed on his coffee. Still a damn shame a man can't sit down and eat a burger. JD turned to him, the smile still lingering at the corner of his mouth. Well, I think that's about to change. Linda appeared, setting a plate in front of him, a classic diner-style cheeseburger, thick-cut fries on the side. Simple but perfect. JD picked it up, took a bite. Silence. Then, with a serious expression, he spoke slowly. A little dry. For a brief moment, the entire diner seemed to pause. Then Dawn burst into laughter. The first genuine, full laugh of the night. A few others chuckled along. Linda shook her head but couldn't hide her smile. JD set the burger down, wiped his hands on a napkin. Kidding. It's good. Dawn was still shaking his head, equal parts amused and exasperated. You're something else, you know that? JD nodded. I've been told. The younger man in the corner said nothing, but his expression had shifted. He wasn't convinced, not entirely, but he wasn't dismissing JD outright anymore either. As JD finished his meal, the diner slowly settled back into its usual rhythm. Conversations picked up, plates clattered, coffee cups were refilled. People still held their opinions, still had their doubts, but for one night in one small town, a different kind of conversation had taken place. Maybe that was enough, because in a world where everyone is quick to argue, sometimes real strength lies in staying, in listening, and in proving, if only for a brief moment, that not everything has to be a fight. This story reminds us of the power of listening, patience, and dialogue. Change doesn't always come from arguing. Sometimes, just staying and hearing someone out is a step forward. If you were in JD Vance's position, what would you have done? Have you ever faced a situation where you had to choose between walking away or staying to stand your ground? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might inspire others and offer new perspectives. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to share it with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of understanding and patience. Thank you for watching. Be sure to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because tomorrow we'll bring you another inspiring story. Have a great day. Thank you for supporting our channel. Like, share, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. These stories are collected from various sources and do not represent any individual or organization. They are shared to promote the values of humanity and understanding in life and have been rewritten with the support of AI. If there are any inaccuracies, we appreciate your understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.